Dante Müller arrived at Schmidt's like a habit half remembered and perfectly executed. The black Mercedes eased onto the curb with the silence of old money and practiced caution. He killed the engine, let the city sound flood the cabin for a breath, and watched the steam lift from his coat into the cold air. The café's windows fogged in soft halos. Inside, Heinrich Schmidt moved between tables with a towel over his shoulder and a small smile that had the steadiness of ritual. The place smelled of roasted beans and buttered pastry, the particular comfort of someone else's kitchen. He kept the same table, by the corner, because the corner allowed him to see the door and the street and the way light used the room. He ordered black coffee, no sugar, the way his grandmother would have scolded him for wasting cream. Habit was a kind of armor. It told him who he was before he had to be anything else. She brought the strudel. Emma Fischer slid the plate down like a small invitation, cheeks warmed by the oven and the early sun. Her hair caught a few threads of light and refracted something in him that he hadn't let himself notice in years. A cheap shift of weight that felt like an error and like grace at once. She set the cup before him with a hand steady enough to betray the fact she had carried more trays than she had wanted. And then she laughed in a way that made the lines around his mouth thaw. "Good morning, Mr. Müller," she said with a tilt, the name on her lips simple and free. He noted the curve of the name as if it were a shape he could map. Her accent had a rounded clarity, German residue softened by years in the city. It lodged in him like an unexpected chord. He had rehearsed little lies for less important people, agents, contractors, a mayoral aide who once thought a favor could be bought with a dinner. He did not lie to Heinrich. The old man saw too clearly. To everyone else, he offered enough of himself to maintain the world he ran, efficient, implacable, untouchable. To Emma, he offered the courtesy of quiet. It was safer that way. She folded the napkin at the side of the plate and left it there. A simple double fold, neat as a promise. He observed it like a small ritual of human economy. Paper turned to shape, a bit of order against the inevitable mess. He surprised himself by noticing the calluses at the base of her thumb, work, not affectation. He had never noticed calluses on anyone in his life. "Nice strudel," he said, meaning less the pastry and more whatever this interruption was. She shrugged, a clean movement. "My grandmother taught me. She was from Kassel. You can tell when someone bakes with love." He registered the word as a condition, and it did something to his chest that had nothing to do with hunger. At the counter, Marco Benedetti slid into the booth across from him with the ease of a man born to a secondary role. Marco smelled of cheap cologne and late nights. He had the blunt, comforting fidelity of someone who knew how to make problems manageable, not how to solve the sickness that birthed them. "Well?" Marco asked. His voice was low. He scanned the room once, a professional reflex. "Business as usual?" Dante watched Emma take the money from an elderly couple at the next table. She listened with a softness that made her fierce. He tried a small experiment with his posture, an old habit. Power had a physics to it, the way you sat, the timing of a laugh, the economy of your silence. He had used it enough to carve out whole neighborhoods on paper and in people's fear. "I can make any woman obey," Dante said then, not to Marco. He heard his own voice, the old hard joke that had become a private mantra in a world that required compliance. The words hung there like a stone dropped into a quiet lake. It was not a boast so much as a confession. He had practiced control like prayer. He had denied himself small softnesses so that larger violences could be permitted. Obedience was not about affection. It was about making the world bend under threat, under the promise of reward, under the neat administration of fear. He said it to feel the shape of himself. Emma, clearing plates, had the distance of someone who overheard things she was not meant to. She paused with a cup in hand, turned, and said, in German, the phrase like a blade softened by light. "Dann hast du mich noch nicht kennengelernt." Dante blanked. The syllables landed with the blunt force of a translation. "You haven't met me," she said, and the translation gave the sentence a private economy he hadn't expected. Her mouth was small when she smiled. Her eyes did not leave him. It was a simple fracture, his private geometry disrupted by a woman who would not recoil. He felt for a second nakedness that had nothing to do with exposure to violence and everything to do with the sudden absence of certainty. "Excuse me?" Marco said, amusement and calculation in equal measure. "She knows German?" Emma crossed to refill the couple's coffee. "Ich spreche nur ein wenig," she said, and this time added in English, "I learned it from my grandmother. She said things you couldn't say without sounding polite." Dante found himself listening to the cadence of her voice in a way he had not listened to anything for years. Power had taught him to measure people's words for threats. Emma's words were not measured, they were spare and warm. "I meant no offense," she added, then surprised him by returning to his table and sliding into the seat opposite his with the audacity of someone unafraid of consequence. Henrik watched them both like someone who had been waiting for an overdue reconciliation between two weather systems. "You're bold," Dante said, and meant it as both observation and warning. "I call it necessary," she returned. "People who commandeer others tend not to notice when the commanded leave." Her English contained a bluntness that made Dante swallow. There was no invective, no melodrama, just an assertion of agency. The world he managed had made a set of economies around obedience, silence, reciprocity, the precise repayments of favors and threats. Emma's sentence suggested that obedience was not a given. It was an exchange, and one that could be declined. He watched the way her hands moved when she cleaned the table, deliberate, patient, and felt a small, unfamiliar ache. For the first time in years, he translated the ache. Not hunger exactly, but a wanting that did not demand payment. They met again, by design and accident. Lincoln Park in spring had the city pretending it was simple. She liked the trees and the way pigeons forgot themselves. He liked the ordinary anonymity of a bench where two people could be seen and not cataloged. They talked about small things, a childhood in a flat full of books, a grandmother who had survived bomb streets and could still make a pastry that refused to crumble. He told her nothing about the ledger that ran his days. Instead, he talked about the first time he had sat in a league of men and learned to move others with a nod. He said it like one tells the story of a sickness, a thing that happened to someone else. She laughed, and he watched the map of her face change. She told him once that she liked the café at dawn because nobody pretended. "People are disarmed by the wrong light," she said. "I don't want to be a lesson." She had the startling grace of someone who did not operate out of fear, unless it was a different kind, fear that sharpened and clarified instead of flattening. He found himself offering small secrets. He told her about a pastry his grandmother made in summer, about how the smell of lemon could make him feel like a child again. She listened like a patient thief. When he admitted that he still sometimes kept his bedroom curtains drawn, she did not recoil. She suggested instead that light could bruise as much as it could heal. Her responses were not subservient. They were choices. On a great Thursday, when shipments were late and his men felt the small hunger of suspicion, a slip in the ledger summoned a different law. Containers arrived with weight missing, invoices that read like riddles. Alex Kozlov's men were at the docks with smiles like currency. Dante's first instinct was absolute. Establish fault, extract an apology, redraw the map. Business required precision. It also asked for a demonstration of will. He called a council at Moretti's, where neutral chairs could be bought with wine and the smell of olive oil. Council meetings were rituals of posture. Who did not stand, who took their coat off first, who met eyes and did not flinch. Dante wore his restraint like armor, but not like a display. Marco sat at his right. Marco's jaw was a stone that did not take well to being unsettled. Dmitri Kozlov was there, older and steady as a hinge, his hands folded like a man who believed in the leverage of time. Alexei was younger, a provocateur with a grin that suggested he had been given the city and wanted to taste it. Negotiations opened with polite curses and an economy of threats. No one drew a weapon. The law of the room ran on silence and the knowledge that someone would eventually speak and decide. Dante practiced patience. "You've been late," Alexei said, the sentence filed with the ease of someone who believed his position unassailable. The word late became a currency. "We make demands." Dante listened. He had been taught to measure people's need through the way their voices settle on consonants. He kept his face still because his hands were a reveal. "Accounts are being reconciled," he answered. His voice had the flat quality that made men believe in inevitability. "Find me the discrepancy. We will settle." Alexei laughed, a small, arrogant sound. "You will settle, and you'll let us get a little more." "You'll get what is agreed," Dmitri interjected, older experience hanging like a lantern between words. "Do not mistake patience for weakness." They left with nods and the rituals of parting. Dante understood the performance and accepted it. He also understood that performance could be a cover for moves beneath the table. He smelled the market shifting like a coming storm. That night he watched the city from his penthouse. Glass, light, the lake a dark blade along the horizon. Inside, the rooms whispered of curated absence, art that did not speak, a piano lesson never learned, the silence of rooms that once felt like achievements. He thought of Emma folding the napkin, of the way she told him she would not be commanded. He felt, absurdly, the blunt ache of that recollection. "Do you want to be happy?" Marco asked bluntly, standing against the window with a cigarette that burned his patience into ash. He did not often ask questions of sentiment. Dante had an answer rehearsed for years. Happiness was not an objective, it was a variable in a ledger. But the ledger had begun to blur at the edges. Emma had blurred it. "I want to be less empty," he said finally. It sounded like truth. "I want not to wake up and check the perimeter like a madman." "You can't have both," Marco said. "The world you'd leave will look for a leader." Dante looked at the lake and imagined a different grief. The grief of leaving power to mend a life that had never been taught to receive gentleness. The choice felt like a fissure between his ribs. 3 days later, the first public slight occurred. A shipment at the South Docks arrived with a mark in the manifest reading like a minor theft. A van flagged the timing of his men. Someone had left a folded napkin, white, the way paper resembled bloodlessness, in his hand during a meeting. It had the number 3 written in hurried ink. A message, perhaps unmeant to him, meant to unsettle. He turned the napkin and thought of Emma's neat folds. He began to double-watch things. Men moved like shadow sentences. He set Marco to trace the leak, to reconcile manifests, to find the human hold and stitch it. Marco was good. He had fingers on many seams. But this was not only business. Someone had taken the currency of his predictability and bent it into a provocation. The abduction came without the salvos he had been bred to expect. It was surgical and cold, a theft of light. Emma did not disappear from the café in a show of force. She vanished between closing and home, a gap in the city's logic. He found out at 2 in the morning, when Marco thrust the phone into his hands and the city shrank to the 3 words of a caller, "She is gone." All the practiced responses, rats, plots, bargaining chips, rallied without warmth. Dante felt the ground of his comprehension change. Panic is not loud for men who have been practiced in dread. It is efficient, surgical. He moved with the precision of someone who had learned to make holes where he pleased. He went to the café, and Henrich's face said everything the city's lights could not. The napkin on the counter remained folded, as if waiting. A text. No ransom note at first, only a picture. Emma sitting in a room with a curtain that did not belong to anyone he recognized. A clock on the wall read a time he did not know. The photo was not violent. That would have been unnecessary. The message beneath was short and clean. Sign. Marco's face went hard. They want a transfer, he said. Control of the South Docks. Immediate. Dante's fingers closed on the phone until his knuckles white. The city was a ledger, and his signature could redraw it. He had always thought that was power. Now it felt like a noose. You won't play this, Marco said. You can't be seen bowing. No. Dante's denial felt small and unheroic. I will do what I have to. He thought of the napkin at the café, folded by hands that baked with love. He thought of the way Emma had said she would not be commanded. The words circled in him like a splinter. They gave him 72 hours, and they gave him a clause, a stipulation that made the outcome seem like legalism, a transfer that would hold for 72 hours, and then, under the terms of a conditional reversion, the agreements could be revisited. They thought it clever. They thought to bind him with time and then force him to return if he wanted to reclaim. They did not know he had been practicing surrender like a prayer. He signed where they told him to sign. He used a pen that left a clean line. The document was thin, designed to do damage to his pride without tearing the city's skin. He had not expected the way the signature would feel like an incision. When he emerged from the room where the transfer had been witnessed, he saw Marco watching him as if waiting for a sign of fracture. Marco's loyalty was the lever he had used to move armies. Marco's eyes, for the first time, showed something like grief. You did what you had to, Marco said. We'll fix it. Dante did not answer. In the quiet that followed, an unexpected clarity descended. He had traded a map for a person. The trade was irrevocable in any meaningful sense. One could not unsee the face of the woman who refused command and still claimed to rule everything else. He slept poorly. The city kept its hours. The lake held its black edge. In his dreams, curtains moved and revealed nothing. He woke to light that felt like a small mercy. Emma returned 3 days later, not to the penthouse, which would have been a theater, but to the café, where Heinrich met her like someone who had said a prayer over the oven. She walked in thin and bluntly human. The shine of morning cut the room into honest things. There were visible marks, a bruise like a shadow under her jaw, and something quieter, a hard newness to her eyes. They sat across from each other while the coffee steamed, and Heinrich pretended to ignore the world, mending the hole he had always trusted a little too fiercely. Dante watched her hands, the way she folded the napkin now with an awareness that had teeth to it. There was no need for a proclamation of obedience. There was instead a conversation held in two kinds of economy, one of the world he had controlled and the other of the life she had not allowed to be taken. She looked at him and said, in the same casual German, "Du hast mich nicht gebrochen." You did not break me. The weight of that sentence made something in Dante drop and, in the dropping, open. He wanted to say many things. He wanted to say the sentence the title demanded, the old boast that he could command and collect obedience. Instead, he found himself searching for what the sentence had cost and what it had purchased. He had signed away pieces of his empire, but in the small, clear hour of her presence, he understood that obedience had never been his to claim. "You are not safe with me," he said, not as a warning, but as a confession. It was the truth and the vow that had been growing like a quiet root in his bones. Emma reached across the table and folded the napkin into a smaller square. "I'm not asking to be safe," she said. "I'm asking to choose." The sentence landed like a verdict, both merciful and exacting. Dante understood then, not only the immediate political price he had paid, but what he would have to pay to remake the rest of his life. Choice was not a currency he practiced. It was a kind of risk that required surrender. Outside, a car passed, black and too familiar, and the lake glinted like a blade. The city continued. Men and markets would call for his attention. Rivals would watch the signature and test the seams. Dmitri would smile and wait for days to see if his conditional clause would be used as a cudgel. But at that table, with steam curling between them and a napkin folded like a truce, something younger and more dangerous than his old pride took root. The idea that surrender could be an act of courage. He did not know how the world would respond. He only knew that he had been destroyed in a way he had not allowed himself to be before, by someone who refused to obey him, who refused to be possessed. The destruction was a small, shattering mercy. When he left the café that afternoon, the ledger of his life felt altered. The black Mercedes waited like an accusation. He sat for a long time with his hands on the wheel, the city pressing against the glass. He had signed. He had survived. He had not, perhaps, bought the expected obedience. He had been undone. A phone rang before dawn the next week. It was a call that turned the fragile architecture of his decision into a battlefield. The voice on the line said two words in a language he had long ago learned to fear. "She's gone." Dante's chest emptied of something that wasn't breath and was all intention. He did not reach for the ledger. He reached for the last of the things he could still manage: clarity of purpose. He called Marco, and together they began to move as they always had, quiet, precise, and with the terrible knowledge that every step they took would be watched. The city outside was an indifferent witness. The napkin in his pocket was damp with his sweat. He realized with an odd, terrible honesty that by claiming he could compel obedience, he had been pretending to be whole. Emma's refusal had exposed the fact that he had never been anything other than fractured. He drove toward the docks because that was where the trail led in the ledger they kept. The city bled into metal and diesel. Lights glanced off water that kept no secrets by choice. He pulled up under a sky that had the remains of twilight and the promise of menace. Men moved like punctuation. He listened for a rhythm that would indicate a lie. They found evidence of the exchange: a van unloaded at an unremarkable warehouse, a watchful gate, a man who had once thought to bargain with Dante's men and now thought better of visibility. They traced signatures, whispers, a chain of small betrayals that amounted to strategy. Alexei had been clever, Dmitri perhaps more so. The world had a way of bending expected outcomes until they resembled compromise. And then the final blow of the night, a message that arrived with clinical certainty. The kidnappers had not been the Kozlovs, but someone working a ledger outside even Dmitri's influence. The transfer had been an opportunity, not a guarantee. The 72 hours clause had been intended as leverage, but leverage had a way of turning on those who thought themselves immune. Dante signed to save her. He had expected hatred in return. Instead, he found something unwinding inside him that might, if he allowed it, become a different kind of life. He thought of the strudel, of Henrik's hands, of his sister Sophia's voice in childhood telling him to be kinder than the world required. He thought, with a tenderness that frightened him, of a small future scribbled in a napkin. He had not yet paid the full price. There were men who would see his signature and press. There were negotiations left untouched and a truce that needed the correct ritual to hold. But at the café, with the napkin folded and the light returning like a patient mercy, he had seen what he could not command, the dignity of someone who refused to obey. Outside, the lake took back the light. Inside, he planned his moves with the patience of a man who had never let himself imagine tenderness. The next calls would be ugly, the nights long. But for the first time since the empire had wrapped around him like a second skin, he understood the form of a sacrifice that did not end in self-congratulation, giving up power so that the person he loved could keep her agency. He started the engine. The Mercedes slid into the night like a shadow returning to its work. Echoes of German words, "Dann hast du mich noch nicht kennengelernt" followed him like a promise or a challenge. He did not know which. He only knew that the rest of his life would be measured against the small, bright fact that when he had believed he could make any woman obey, a waitress had replied that she would not. He drove toward the docks, toward council rooms and meetings, and a signing that would be watched in every corner of the city. The ledger demanded its payment. The city would test his choice. But in the quiet between gears, between one decision and the next, something tender had begun to press at the edges of his life. He would learn, in the days to come, the true cost of surrender. He would learn the price of choice. He would learn how to live with the knowledge that some things a man could not take, no matter how young he had been when he inherited the empire, and that some things were worth relinquishing everything for. He pulled onto the highway and thought only of the napkin in his pocket, folded small and precise like a future that refused to be commanded. He wondered, for the first time in a long time, what it would feel like to be chosen rather than obeyed. The city slid past, indifferent and enormous, and he drove into it with a new kind of hunger. He parked beneath the low, brutalist facade of the headquarters where the ledger was kept, a building of concrete ribs and glass that no one bothered to pretend was anything but a machine. Men in dark coats slipped through its revolving doors like cogs returning to place. Dante adjusted the napkin in his pocket as if it were an amulet and climbed the stairs two at a time. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and old paper. The council room had been arranged for theater. A long table, heavy chairs, the ledger itself set on a plinth as though it were a relic. Dmitri sat at the head, a slow, careful smile that never reached his eyes. Around him were the men who answered to statutes older than any single man. Alexei, pale and practiced, a quiet lieutenant named Rolf, a woman with a narrow jaw whose ledger entries read like executions. They fell into silence when Dante answered, the kind of silence that maps loyalties. "You were late," Dmitri said without looking up. Dante let the coat fall from his shoulders. "Traffic," he said. He had the awkwardness of a man who had once learned how to move through threats and now found himself rehearsing an apology for a different sin. He felt the napkin like a pulse against his thigh. Dmitri steepled his fingers. "We expected a different signature this evening. The transfer was intended to close this week. There are parties who will not show patience." Alexei's eyes flicked to him like a predatory animal checking the wind. Someone outside our reach took the liberty of testing the system. There are eyes watching every ledger column now. They will not forgive slack. "They tested our rules," Dmitri said. "They will test us again. You cannot." He paused, and his voice acquired a knife's edge. "You cannot invite weakness." Dante sat. He kept his hands visible. He wanted, in that room, to keep the shape of his decision simple and unornamented. The ledger demanded payment, and payment had names. He had signed for Emma's release. He had committed a breach against the currency that had built him. Now the question that sat like a second heart on his chest was how to answer what he had done. "You spoke to Emma," Alexei said. "You signed for her. Why?" There was accusation in the way he said it, as if compassion were a misdemeanor. Dante thought of the strudel at the café, of hands that smelled of flour and mercy, of a voice that refused to fold. He thought of Henrik and Sophia, and of the napkin, folded precise. He let the memory sit between his ribs like a small, stubborn flame. "Because she would not be commanded," he said. His voice surprised him. It was both soft and steady. "Because I could have taken, as always, because I chose not to." There was a collective inhalation, as though the room had been waiting for the exact shape of his confession. Rolf's face was flat. "You chose poorly then. There will be consequences. The ledger does not care for the nature of choice." "No," Dmitri agreed, "it does not. And now men will move to capitalize on your sentiment. The 72 clause," he tapped the ledger with a finger, Was leverage meant to enforce obedience across many contracts? You rescind the leverage and you create a vacuum. Someone will rush to fill it. Dante folded his fingers. The plan he had not yet told them was not entirely formed. It was more a compass than a map. He had surrendered something private to save a woman's freedom. When the room had spoken itself out like a lung exhausted of breath, Dante reached into his pocket and unfolded the napkin. He smoothed it on the table with 2 fingers. The paper had a faint grease mark at the corner where he had held it the time at the café. It looked absurd and holy at once, like a child's ordinance. "I will not announce the dissolution tonight," he said. "That would be folly. We will win men slowly. We will make a new clause and test it. We will create a trust, an arbitration body outside our immediate chain, that will oversee disputes involving human agency. The ledger will remain, but a section of it will be sacrosanct and public, accessible to any who feel pressed into service. Entries there cannot be enforced by coercion." Dimitri's jaw tightened. "You make a courtroom for sentiment. Who will sit in this trust? Your baker? Your sister?" Dante's chest warmed at the mention of Sophia and Henrik. He did not laugh. "People of good repute. Men and women with no stake in our enforcement arms. Names would be independent. Their mandate would be to adjudicate claims of coercion. Their rulings would be public and binding on our administrative apparatus." "Binding?" Alexei repeated. "You mean binding under what authority? Yours? You wipe your hand across the ledger and call it law?" "I mean binding under institutional redesign," Dante said. "We will alter the mechanics of enforcement. We will convert penalties into structural disincentives. Men who violate the sacrosanct section lose access to our tools. They will not be able to enlist our muscle. They will lose money," Rolf supplied. "They will lose profit. They will not lose flesh. He who profits by breaking the law will be deprived of profit. Men are mercenary. If you make the price of coercion higher than the price of compliance, they'll comply, not out of virtue, but calculation." Dimitris considered him as if trying to determine whether he had been struck by a fever. "And if they do not play by calculation? Then they become pariahs," Dante said. "They cut themselves out of the market and from us. We will not, however, respond with the ledger's old muscle to enforce personal vendettas. If the trust rules against someone, we will implement economic and administrative sanctions. We will strip them of warehouses, of routes, of licenses they need for the trade. We will starve the practice out of existence." Alexei's lips went white. "And our competitors? They will force their own hand. There are places where men do not fear loss of profit. There are men who will burn the city before they avail themselves to law." Dante's gaze hardened. "Then let them burn. We will not be pyromaniacs beneath every roof. We will choose. We will not keep burning others in order to keep our candles lit." There was a long pause. The men looked at one another and at the napkin, which now seemed more like a map than a relic. Plans would have to be drawn. Which assets to reclassify, which names to appoint, how to manage the blowback. There were technicalities and rusted loyalties to sand away. Finally, Dimitri said, "You have given us a starting point. We will need time to reorganize the ledger's architecture. We'll need to identify allies in the city who will lend credence to the trust. You'll face litigation from investors and threats from men who profit from the old system." Dante did not blink. "I accept that." "In return," Dimitri said, "you must publicly take responsibility for the policy. If it fails, the blame will be yours. If it succeeds, the spoils will be thin. Are you prepared to be a man of little credit in exchange for being a man with a different conscience?" Dante thought of Emma's face when she had stepped back from being claimed. He thought of a napkin folded into a small future. He thought of being chosen rather than obeyed. "I am," he said. Dimitri smiled without warmth. "Then we proceed. Tomorrow we convene a narrower council and draft the new clauses. We will need your signatures, your authority. Be mindful, you are exposing yourself." Dante rose. The room watched him like tidewater watching a horizon. He folded the napkin carefully and slid it back into his pocket. His hand felt lighter for an instant and then heavier, as though the act of making a promise weighed in a new way. "One more thing," Dante said. "I will speak to Emma, not as a debtor, but as a man who owes her an apology." Dimitri's expression changed in microseconds, a calculation of advantage. Then he inclined his head. "Do what you must." As Dante left the council chamber, the city's hum returned, low and indifferent. Outside, a delivery van backed into a dock with practiced violence. Men shifted in the street, and gestures passed quick like courtesy. He walked to his car with the slow, certain steps of someone emerging from one kind of war into another. He did not know whether he had chosen well. He only knew that the shape of his nights would change. There would be fewer midnight bargains and more daylight reckonings. There would be men who would try to stab him with the ledger's rust. There would be men who would test whether a man who had given up a blade could still strike with intent. At the wheel, the napkin warmed the inside of his coat like a promise. He imagined Emma in some other part of the city, free, furious, perhaps forgiving. The image steadied him with a new gravity. The calls that came that night were sharp and insistent. An investor who wanted clarity, a warehouse master who wanted assurance, a courier who spoke of men gathering at 3 docks on the east side. He made notes, arranged meetings, assigned tasks. The machinery of the old order sputtered and recalibrated, like an engine being wrenched to accept a new kind of fuel. When he finally closed his eyes that night, it was with the sense that a siege had only begun. The ledger's columns were patient. They had a way of compiling history and delivering reckoning. Dante slept not like a man absolved, but like one who had lit the first candle in a room he had always kept dark. Morning came with a thin frost and an unexpected clarity. At dawn, he went to the café. The bell over the door chimed, a simple human sound. Emma was there, wiping down a table, hair pinned with a practicality that made her profile a quiet defiance. They spoke without the old language of claims. He thanked her for the refusal, for the way she had refused to be catalogued. She answered with a look that did not undo the debt, but did not amplify it either. It was, for the moment, enough. He left the café with a lighter pocket and a heavier day. The city around him had already begun to resort itself into camps. Men in tailored coats muttered into phones. A small convoy of trucks left the docks with curtains drawn tight. A new ledger entry had been drafted overnight, crude and urgent. Section V, Sanctions Against Coercion. It was only ink and intent, but ink has teeth. When he returned to headquarters the second time that day, there was a white envelope on his desk, unmarked. Inside were photos, warehouses, names, a ledger page annotated in a hand he recognized as not entirely unknown. The handwriting belonged to someone who kept accounts of subtle violence. It was a list of men who would profit if enforcement were allowed to continue unchecked. Dante pinched the bridge of his nose. The decision he'd made had already begun to mobilize networks. Some sought shelter, others smelled opportunity. He set the photos face down and called Alexei in. "Find me the men on this list," he said. "Not to break them tonight, to speak to them, to offer them the calculus we'll be using, to make clear that this city will no longer make obedience a commodity." Alexei's expression was a closed book. You know how they respond to overtures. Make them see the price. Dante's voice was low, an edge honed by fatigue and resolve. If they refuse, name them. Let the city see their signatures. And yet, even as he plotted, a part of him cataloged the risks as a surgeon catalogues blood. Necessary, messy, probably inevitable. He had invited a new kind of warfare, One fought with legislation and exposures and the slow erosion of profitable cruelty. It would not be clean. It would often feel like surrender. He sat alone for a moment with the ledger open in front of him, its pages waiting like snowfields to be tracked. He thought of the nights ahead, negotiations with men who saw language as leverage, threats delivered through anonymous envelopes, the possibility, always present, that a signature meant nothing when knives had been sharpened in the dark. A knock at the door announced Dmitri's return. The man entered with the calm of someone who had never feared being measured. "We begin the drafting at 2, Dmitri said. "You will be present. You will speak in public soon. Be ready." Dante nodded. He reached into his pocket, smoothed the napkin once more, and tucked it back into a place where it could remind him of a new ledger, life counted by choices rather than by columns. He went to meet the men who would become his reluctant allies and his certain enemies. The pen hovered above the paper of the new clauses like a held breath. He drew it down. They gathered in the council room by 2 o'clock, the space smelling faintly of ink and boiled coffee, the midday light through the high windows cutting the dust into thin, righteous bars. Men and women came with their faces practiced for compromise. A mill owner who kept his hands clean in other people's contracts, a teacher who had organized late-night shelters, a small-time magistrate with more fear than authority. Alexei moved among them like a shadow that knew the architecture of hesitation. Dmitri took the head of the table with the quiet assurance of someone who thought victory could be measured in minutes. Dante set the ledger down between them and opened it like an oath. "We are not here to punish," he said, and his voice did what his handwriting could not. It made a promise sound like a strategy. "We are here to change the terms by which this city has traded obedience for coin." There were nods and furtive looks. The mill owner rubbed his jaw. "You mean expose them," he said, "publicly." "I mean offer them a choice," Dante corrected. "Publicly if they refuse, but choice first. We speak, we give them the calculus, we make the consequences visible." A woman from the docks, calloused palms, a scar at the brow, leaned forward. "They'll laugh at calculus," she said. "They understand knives." Dmitri's smile was small and bright. "Then let them be the ones who have to explain the knives to the city." Alexei folded his hands and said nothing for a beat, then spoke as if willing his caution into the room. "Names have weight," he said. "Once you put a man at the edge, he does one of 3 things. He repents, he hides, or he fights. We must be ready for all 3. Dante had expected that. He had planned contingencies the way a surgeon maps arteries. There would be outreach to those whose livelihoods depended on the old order, offers to buy out contracts, assistance for men who feared retribution. There would be a press, carefully cultivated, set to deliver the revelations should reason fail. And there would be, he knew, men who would try to burn the ledger rather than sign to its terms. They divided tasks. Alexei would lead the conversations, with Dante joining when needed. Dmitri would handle logistics, security, safe houses, transport. The teacher would mobilize networks for those displaced. The mill owner offered funds that smelled faintly of compromise, but got the work moving. Names were circled on paper, phone numbers exchanged in the quiet shorthand of the desperate. Dante left the meeting with the taste of metal in his mouth, a sensation that always accompanied large decisions. Outside, the street had thickened into late afternoon business. A boy trying to sell lemons, 2 policemen who pretended not to know the outlines of what was happening. He walked toward the docks because the first name on the list worked there, and because he wanted to see the place where the city's commerce met its appetite for silence. The dock where he found Paolo was a place of angles, ropes knotted like promises, cranes like indifferent gods. Paolo was thinner than the photograph, which somehow made him look more dangerous. The man's jaw was packed with indignation, his hands constantly measuring empty air as if counting debts. "You're not the only one with an idea about the city," Paolo told Dante without preface. You think you can come and stop the world by writing it on paper? Dante met the measure of the man's anger with a steadiness that had been earned in rooms like this. I'm offering you an account, he said, a ledger you can sign that limits what you can do for profit. If you refuse, I will put your name in the public record. People will know who trades obedience for shelter. Paolo laughed, a harsh sound. Do you know what happens when men read a ledger? They look for where it touches their own neck. You think I don't? Dante replied. He did not threaten. He described instead the benefits for those who signed, legal protections for workers, channels for disputes that did not involve beatings, oversight that rerouted payments. He offered a bargain that was not simply mercy, but a new structure of incentives. It was the kind of speech that expected men to imagine a different future for themselves and for the city. Paolo's eyes narrowed. For a long moment, neither man moved. Finally, the dock worker rose and walked away, his shoulders a series of abrupt decisions. Dante watched him go and tucked the encounter into the ledger's margin as one might mark a chapter. Back at headquarters, the day unfurled into work. Calls, drafts, the slow art of making law sound like salvation. Dmitri arranged for discreet security at the meeting places. Alexei came back with the flavor of the conversations, some soft, some like the rasp of a blade. At dusk, Dante went to the café for a coffee he barely tasted. Emma was there, arranging chairs, her movements a grammar of small defiance. You look tired, she said, without looking up. You have good instincts, he answered. He had meant it as praise. She took it as fact. There was a pause in which the city held its breath, and he finally said aloud what had been a small back and forth in his mind all day. If they refuse, I'll name them. Emma met him, not with pleading, but with an arithmetic. Names make enemies, she said. They also make martyrs. Do we let them keep making martyrs? Dante asked. She wiped a cup and set it down with a sound like a small verdict. Do it clearly, she said. Give them the chance. Do not pretend the ledger is a sword if it's only a list. And guard yourself. They don't play by rules. That night, after the offices blinked their closing lights, there was a delivery. A single envelope slipped under Dante's door. Inside, a napkin, coffee-stained and folded, with a single line written in the hand that had annotated the photos earlier. You are making a dangerous promise. Dante held the napkin between finger and thumb, its fibers soft and banal as the threats had implied. He thought of Paolo's jaw, of Dimitri's quiet smile, of Emma's practical defiance. He thought of the men he had already decided to speak to and of those he had not yet reached. He placed the napkin on the ledger and left it there like a bookmark. The pages beside it held plans and names and the small, stubborn arithmetic of a city that might be different. He understood the next step. Speak in public, lay out the clauses, give the men the choice. He also understood that speaking would change something irretrievable. The ledger would no longer be ink and intent. It would be a challenge thrown into the market of power. He slept a little that night, and in the thin hours a thought kept returning, one that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with consequence. Power, he realized, is a currency traded in both generosity and fear. To spend it wisely would require him to give away some of what he had hoarded, certainty. Dawn would bring more meetings, more men who would decide for themselves whether to sign. It would bring the drafting session with the council and the first public reading. It would bring, perhaps, the moment when some man with more teeth than sense would choose violence over ledger entries. Dante rose before daybreak, adjusted the napkin in his jacket as one might secure a talisman, and walked back into a city that had begun to listen. He had lit a candle, but the room's darkness was not yet gone. He felt its edges and moved to throw light with words and laws and the slow calculation of pressure. Outside, a courier waited in the alley. He handed Dante a card. No words, only a single name and an address on the edge of the industrial quarter. Someone had not waited to be offered the calculus. Someone had signed a counteroffer. Dante read the name and felt the ledger tilt beneath his hand. He folded the card and put it into his pocket. Then he set off toward the place where that name could change everything. He walked with the certainty of a man who had to choose whether to meet a threat with patience or to answer it with the same blunt instrument. The city watched, in the small ways cities watch. Windows half open, a radio switching channels, a dog that refused to stop barking. By the time he reached the address on the card, the sun had already burned the night's thin frost to steam. He stood before a warehouse whose windows were dark and whose door had been freshly painted. There was a man waiting there, and behind him, in the slips of shadow, more. When Dante stepped forward, Dimitri's hand closed over his elbow, not in restraint, but in solidarity. "If this goes sideways," Dimitri said softly, "remember why we started." Dante considered the ledger in his mind, the clauses, the margins, the names. He thought of Emma's face at the café, of Alexei's folded hands, of Paolo's narrow-eyed retreat. He thought of the city's appetite for stories that turned private violence into public lessons. He pushed the door open. The men inside let him into a room that smelled of oil and old promises. They sat like judges who had only ever needed to be feared. One of them, thin, with a small goose of a smile, spoke first. "You want signatures," he said. "You came to offer us a contract." Dante set the ledger on a crate and opened it. "I offer restraint," he said, "limits that bind us all, so the city may not trade flesh for compliance. Sign, or refuse and be named." There was laughter, low and dangerous. Then a voice from the back, suddenly precise. "And if we refuse," the voice asked, "you put our names in the paper. And then what? The city eats our names and spares the men who depend on us? You think that is justice?" Dante looked at the man. There was pleading in the question, hidden like a stone under a pond. "It's a start," Dante said. "Not perfect, not immediate justice, but it's a structure that will make their profit visible and their punishment a matter of law. It's a wound that can be cauterized instead of being allowed to fester." The thin man stood. "You do not know what it is to run these docks," he said. "You do not know the hunger. Laws don't feed mouths." "I know hunger will not be fixed by hunger," Dante replied. "I know that men will be sacrificed so others can sleep. I'm asking you to stop making economics from someone else's fear." There was a long silence. Outside, a gull called, a pinprick note of indifferent life. The thin man sat back down. He took a breath that tasted like someone about to bargain with a knife. "We will think on it," he said finally. "We will not sign today." Dante closed the ledger and rose. He had expected refusals. He had not expected the thin man's words to land with such a particular grief. He left with the sense of a conversation deferred rather than finished, which is often the same thing. On the way back, his pocket vibrated with an incoming note, slipped under the door of a different life. Emma had left a message at the café, a small line that read, "Be careful who you shame. Some people only know shame." Dante did not know whether she meant the men at the docks or the men in fine coats who watched from their offices. He simply folded the words into himself and walked on. That night, in the ledger's margins, he wrote, "Step, name, risk, elevated." He added a line for contingencies and circled it twice. At dawn, he would stand before the council and read a clause that might become law. He would speak in public and set the needle into the city's moral compass. He would, perhaps, make enemies who did not understand numbers and allies who did. He aligned himself in the quiet, feeling the ledger like a pulse in his hand, and prepared for the city to respond. Outside, someone had set another napkin on the doorstep. This one was blank. He left it there like a challenge and turned back into the room where the ledger waited, its pages loose and patient, willing to be filled. He picked up his pen. He crossed the line. He began to write.